Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 72 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening! The three creatures hobbled closer, grotesque bodies creeping over the earth. Their clawed hands dug into the ground, and they snapped grooved teeth. Lucan muttered an unrepeatable curse. Though they had already searched the whole chamber, Janir couldn't stop herself from looking for some escape they had missed. They couldn't die here. She and Lucan had both survived far too much to die here. "Follow me," Lucan whispered. He snaked a hand behind his back and groped along the floor until he found a large rock. "Don't fall behind." Lucan hurled the rock straight into the temple of the Morsane on the left. The creature snapped backwards, collapsing to the ground with a yowl that made Janir's ears throb. Lucan grabbed her wrist and raced to the empty sarcophagus just as the other two snarled and leapt for them. Lucan kicked back the first one, knocking it across the room. "Hold them off," he yelled. "How?" Janir frantically watched as the two Morsanes drew closer, and the third stumbled upright. "Bite them if you want. I don't care." Lucan grabbed the edge of the sarcophagus and shoved, straining against the coffin's weight. Janir didn't know what she was going to do when she turned around, and the creatures came scuttling toward her, jaws snapping. The first Morsane lunged and grabbed her ankle, crushing its teeth into her shin. Janir yelped and kicked it in the head. The Morsane jumped back, stumbling and growling. Warm blood ran down her leg, but Janir ignored it. If Lucan could keep fighting with a broken rib, she could manage with a little nip. She just hoped the bloody thing wasn't poisonous. She snatched up a piece of the debris from the ceiling and chucked it at the next advancing Morsane. Her aim wasn't as good as Lucan's, but it did make the creature skirt to the side. The Constancy star hung loose around her neck, jostling and making it hard to see. She snatched up as many rocks as she could hold, throwing them as quickly as possible. The Morsanes gurgled in annoyance, and one broke off from the others to circle around. Janir tried to head him off with her rocks, but its companions sprang for her with bared teeth, forcing her to deal with them first. Lucan grunted at her back, and the sarcophagus scraped over the floor, but she didn't look to see what he was doing. He seemed to have a plan, and she was willing to give anything a shot at this point. "Janir!" She backed toward the sound of his voice. Her bruised spine hit the top of the sarcophagus, and she looked to find Lucan had climbed on top of it. He stood beneath one of the holes left by the Morsanes, beckoning. Janir scrambled up the side of the coffin, using the ornate carving for handholds. The moment she reached the top, Lucan snatched the rocks out of her hands and pelted them at the Morsanes, striking one in the face, and two others along the sides. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them for a few seconds. Before the creatures could recover, Lucan grabbed Janir's hand and pointed toward the Morsane's tunnel. "You first," he shouted. "But what?" Lucan yanked her under the opening. "No time. Go." Janir had so many questions. What if it was just a narrow tunnel too small for anything but the Morsanes? But Lucan knelt and webbed his fingers in a step, and now wasn't the time for discussion. She planted her foot in his hands, and between the two of them, her head and shoulders made it through the hole. Janir was surprised to find herself breaking through a solid upper-level floor just as dark and dank as the one below it. She gripped the edge of the hole and fought to haul herself up. The sharp rock bit into her stomach, and her fingernails splintered. It dragged over her cotton burns, but she didn't let it slow her. "Hurry up!" Lucan shouted, shoving on her feet. Janir gritted her teeth and clawed upwards. Once she got her hips over the side, she could scramble out of the way to make room for Lucan. Below, the Morsanes were closing in, hissing and growling. There were thuds and angry snarls. Lucan must have pelted them with rocks again. "Give me your hand," Lucan yelled. Janir grimaced. She wasn't strong enough to haul Lucan up on her own, but she dropped onto her belly and thrust her hand down. By the light of the constancy star, she could make out Lucan's knotted face as he seized her hand. Lucan jumped, and Janir pulled as hard as she could. Lucan kicked in the air for a moment, then his other hand found the upper edge of the hole, and he was able to drag his shoulders through. Janir grabbed the back of his tunic and yanked with all her might. With a combined effort, they hauled Lucan into the long stone corridor above. The constancy star showed a hall about 2 sword lengths wide and 3 high, stretching from left to right as far as the light of the star fell. Strangely, the only hole in the floor was the one they had just come through. Shouldn't there be 3? The enraged hiss of a Morsane caught Janir's attention. A bulbous face appeared through the same dark hole. The snarly Morsane lunged for Janir, clawed hands fast as adders. Lucan's fist slammed into the thing's face. The creature let off a yelp and plummeted, smashing its head on the sarcophagus below. Its companions cooed anxiously over it, then backed away, snarling at the humans above. Janir panted, not realizing how fast her heart had been throbbing. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Lucan muttered. "You?" "One bit me, but I think I'll live." "They're not poisonous." Lucan must have read her expression. He rose to his feet, muttering something about "no good deed goes unpunished," and holding his side. Janir stood, never taking her eyes off the Morsanes in the chamber below. "At least we're 1 level closer to the top." She wasn't sure Lucan would appreciate optimism, but it was worth a shot. "Janir?" At the edge in his voice, she looked up. He was staring into the darkness before them, tense as the skin on a drum. She followed his gaze and had to hold back a scream. Morsanes, dozens and dozens of them, peered down the corridor with those eerie yellow eyes. Their bodies crushed together in a tight press as they crowded the far side of the tunnel like insects. Janir swallowed and moved closer to her brother. Why had she ever believed things were getting better? That was always when they got worse. "What do we do?" Her heart was in her throat at the thought of being clawed and gnawed to death. What would happen to Seovan if she died here? To Carlisle? Armandius? Brevia? Lucan grabbed her hand and whispered, "Run." They whirled around and ran as fast as they possibly could. Lucan tugged Janir along despite her best efforts to keep up. If he had let go of her hand, she was sure he could have outpaced her in a matter of moments, but he gripped her so tight she lost feeling in her fingers. The Morsanes let off a shared snarl and scuttled after them. Some raced on the ground, others raced along the walls, and some even chased them upside down from the pockmarked ceiling. Janir raced as fast as she could. Fear spiked through her like lightning, driving her on with every ounce of energy she had. "Come on!" Lucan reached an intersection of the tunnel a step ahead and swerved to the right. "Faster!" he shouted. Janir was moving as fast as she could, but she dug deeper, hoping that, just maybe, she could force just a little more speed out of her body. Up ahead, she could see nothing but endless tunnels. She had no doubts the creatures would catch them unless something miraculous happened. The Morsanes gained ground with every stride, closer, closer, closer. Janir was sure she could feel the air move as clawed hands reached out. They rounded another corner, and Janir's heart sank to her slippers. A horde of the creatures headed them off from the front. They were trapped. Janir squeezed Lucan's hand tighter. Her brother yanked her tight against his side, glancing from the left to the right and even to the floor and ceiling, but there was no escape. "Lucan, The floor gave way like melted wax, and the next thing Janir knew, her hand was ripped from her brother's, and she was tumbling down, down, down. Everything was topsy-turvy, and she couldn't tell up from left, right, or anything else. Lucan swore, and by the shaking light of the constancy star, she could make out that he fared no better. A bone-rattling rumble shook the earth. The Morsanes screeched, then fell silent. Janir's brains jarred, and she was sure she would vomit by the time she came to a stop, lying on her back. Everything was silent, save for Janir's own heart and Lucan's muttered curses. "Pest problem," Lucan grumbled. "Pest problem! Ha!" Janir laid still. She couldn't hear the Morsanes. Why would the creatures go quiet again after being worked into that frenzy? She sat up, keeping her mouth firmly closed. Nausea threatened to purge her gut. The world was spinning and she swayed like a drunk. She put her hands out to steady herself. "You need to go back up." Janir jumped at the familiar child's voice. "You!" Lucan shouted. He scrambled upright but wobbled with dizziness. The girl with the crown of butterflies twisted one finger around a dark curl. "No more games, or so help me, I will—" "You can't hurt me, Prince," the small figure replied with just a hint of frustration. "I have trapped the Earth Dwellers. Now, do you want to know the way out?" Lucan glared at the creature. He was angry, he was tense, and she was an easy fixture for his frustration. Still, he nodded. "That would be appreciated," he clipped. "I thought so." The creature pointed a plump hand to the side. "Over there is a passage. Follow it until you reach the 7th door on the right. Take that passage until you come to the staircase, and that will take you back to your people." Janir pushed herself off the ground, head shaken. The slope they had tumbled down stretched up a good 30 feet. "Who are you?" Janir mumbled. "Why would you help us?" The girl's large brown eyes fixed on Janir. "Father commanded it." "Why?" Lucan demanded, but the girl was gone. Lucan swore. He seemed to be swearing quite a bit. "That's unspeakably annoying," he bellowed to the emptiness. Janir doubted the strange creature cared either way, and she still had the feeling she had seen the child somewhere before. Her brother trudged off in the direction the creature had indicated. "Come on," he growled at Janir. Janir shuffled after him, nausea still threatening to overwhelm her. The Morsanes were gone for now, and she was too tired to dwell on the mystery of the strange girl. Now that her head felt comparatively stable, Janir could make out that they had landed in some sort of cavern. Its size made Janir think it must have been hewn by nature, but the markings and half-buried figures carved into the walls made her wonder. Had this once been some grand ceremonial chamber? There must be countless forgotten stories within these walls. Time for fanciful thinking later. Janir trotted after her brother, fully appreciative that the Morsanes were no longer breathing down their necks. Janir turned at a whisper of wind from behind. She peered into the dark, but could make out nothing. Not even the glow of the Morsanes' yellowed eyes. Fighting back a shiver of fear, she whirled around and skirted after Lucan. Lucan had already reached the doorway the girl creature had indicated. The light of her constancy star shone down a hall, dusted with years. It rose 2 times the height of a man, and stretched wide enough for 3 or 4 to walk abreast. There were knobs and curves in the stone where there had once been faces and runes etched into the walls, but time had all but erased most of them. As far as the light of the constancy star shone, they could see no sign of danger. "Do you think we can trust that thing?" Janir whispered. "She wouldn't lie to us," Lucan answered. "Not about her father." Janir didn't know what to say for a moment. "You know her?" "I know of her. Do you think we have time to find another way?" Lucan shot back. With impeccable timing, a scratching sound came from high overhead, the Morsanes trying to break through. "But what is she?" Without a word, Lucan marched on. He stepped into the hall. Janir followed close behind her brother, every sense prickling with fear. Lucan's cryptic reassurances had done little for her confidence, and she wasn't sure if they should follow the creature's directions or not. The moment they stepped into the hall, the ground began to tremble. Janir tried to run back out the way they had come, but Lucan seized her wrist and hauled her further into the corridor. Janir wasn't about to try fighting him, and so she followed at a brisk trot, praying that her faith in Lucan and his faith in the mysterious child were not misplaced. The crashing and crumbling of stone came from behind. The tunnel was falling in on itself. Janir clutched her constancy star to keep it steady and ran for her life alongside her brother. There were no archways of passages branching off, no narrow corridors to lead them out of the collapse's wake. Only a single winding hall with sealed tombs lining either side. Janir's lungs gulped in the stale air and her muscles protested at the effort. Every step felt like it would be her last, but she always managed to make one more. Lucan shouted something, but his words were lost to the roar of the crashing earth. The hall was fast falling at their backs. The shaking stopped. Lucan and Janir ran for a few more paces, then doubled over, panting. Lucan clutched his side, the side with his injured ribs, and warily eyed the way at their backs. Janir followed his gaze to behold a barrier of rock, sealing them off from the way they had come. When she finally regained her breath, Janir straightened and looked to the way ahead. It was nothing but more of the same passage. "Come," Lucan shortly commanded. Despite still favoring his side, he set off at a brisk pace. Janir compliantly trotted after him, then jerked to a halt to keep from bumping into him. She peered over his shoulder and her mouth dropped. Candles, buried in the floor every few paces, flickered into life. Their flames burned straight and steady, no wind to disturb them. The long line stretched down the corridor as far as Janir could see down the center of the hall. The constancy star dimmed in the candlelight. "Come on," Lucan repeated, with less cool acceptance this time. He went first, walking along the side of the candle row, careful not to get too close to the open flames. Janir flanked him like a nervous colt, one hand wrapped around her constancy star, tighter by the moment. She sensed no magic from the lights, yet what else could it be? Had their mysterious benefactress done this as well? Even if there didn't appear to be any immediate danger, how she wished Seovan and Kyle were with her. She missed them with a sharp ache that lanced through her like a spear. She hoped with all her heart that they and the others were safe. The candles winked out as Janir and Lucan passed them. There was no puff of wind or anything else. The candles simply went cold. When Janir looked back, they had vanished. "Lucan?" Her brother gave a gruff grunt in reply. "You said you knew of that girl." "I did." Janir waited. Lucan did not elaborate, and she decided he wasn't going to. Being forthcoming was not one of his virtues. "Stay close," was all he said. Janir wouldn't have dreamt of wandering off, certainly not after the past few hours, and she brimmed with questions about their patroness, and why Lucan was going through so much trouble to save his sister, and why he had saved her life at least thrice now. Still, she held her tongue. They followed the trail of candles. Only the rustle of their clothes and the pad of their footsteps broke the stillness. Lucan kept one hand over his side, and fresh worry wormed its way through Janir's gut. Her brother was hurt, and even if he would have let her help him, she didn't know what she could do. Finally, the twisting passage opened up into an entry, spanning upwards, disappearing into blackness. The trail of candles ascended a flight of stairs, coiling skyward like a stone snake. Lucan shuffled to the foot of the staircase. It was cracked and chipped here and there, the signs of disuse and neglect marring its former majesty. Cobwebs wove between the rails, and bits of broken stone littered the steps. Janir joined Lucan just as he slumped down on the bottom step, still holding his side. A prickle of concern shot down her spine. "Lucan, are you—" "No." Her brother snarled like a wounded lion. He glared in her face as if this were all her fault. "I need a moment." It was so different from the restrained protectiveness she remembered. Janir bit her lip. He might be here because he'd been trying to save her, but it hardly seemed fair to blame her for that. Nonetheless, Lucan didn't seem to be in a reasonable mood. Arguing with him would be pointless. "Is there anything I can do?" "You can carry me topside. How does that sound?" He spat. Janir turned her back on him without another word. If she said something, she'd probably regret it. Though frustration with him was a welcome distraction from the Morsanes. She stared into the darkness, willing to let her brother decide when to move, despite everything. They maintained a tense silence for several moments. Janir could have sworn she saw Morsane eyes peering from the dark, but when she blinked, she realized they were just flickers from the trail of candles. She began to consider the Temple of Tarkoth as a safe haven. The Lord Argatalam would be keeping her captive, but at least he hadn't expressed a desire to eat her raw. Janir covertly surveyed Lucan. He was slumped at an odd angle, probably to take the strain off his damaged side. One hand fondled his opposite wrist. At first, Janir thought it was his sleeve, but then the light caught a braided cord, made from some dark material. That's what struck her as odd, the sheen. It wasn't quite metallic, but... She wanted to ask about it, yet sincerely doubted her brother was capable of giving a non-sardonic response. Lucan caught her watching, his jaw clenched. Lucan gripped the cord, glaring at her as if in challenge. Janir sighed and looked away. They stayed in an uncomfortable silence for a long time. Janir wanted to move, and not just because her mind was generously fabricating a Morsane in every shadow. The rush from their run and the flight from the Morsanes had worn off, leaving her to fully appreciate the expansive collection of cuts and bruises from their 2 falls. Janvisa gave it to me. Silence had hung between them for so long, Janir almost jumped. She looked to her brother. Lucan studied the bracelet. He traced the braid pattern with one finger, touching it like it was a butterfly or some other delicate creature. Janir remembered Janvisa. Janvisa had been the young healer assigned to tend her when she was in Adasha. Janvisa had also been the one to look after Lucan when he had returned from the Revelis Peninsula, delirious with an infected wound. Lucan shifted. The candlelight fell on a script, braided into the pattern. He looked so vulnerable sitting there with his head bowed and his shoulders rounded. Now Janir could make out that the braid was painstakingly woven into a Tathansian alphabet, twisting and curving runes that made no sense to her. What does it say? At first, Janir wasn't sure Lucan had heard her. She'd barely spoken at all. Then he took a breath. Return to me. Janir bowed her head. She felt the weight of the constancy star more than ever. We should go. Lucan snapped. He bolted to his feet before she could utter another word, yanking his sleeve down over the bracelet as he did. He whirled around and marched up the staircase, not waiting for her a moment longer. Janir had a feeling that Lucan would be all the harsher for that moment that moment lacking hostility. She was not disappointed. Hurry up. If you fall behind, I'm not waiting for you. Then her brother whirled around. For all his talk of leaving her behind, Lucan's ascent was laboriously slow. He moved with the struggle of a rheumatic and cradled his side. Janir grew sorer by the moment, and her bruises had begun to throb. But after watching him suffer for half an hour or so, she offered him help. His biting reply and deathly glare were enough to put aside the idea of ever doing that again. They trekked slowly but surely, up, and up. Soon all that could be seen was what appeared to be a black abyss. Janir determinedly did not look down. The staircase was crumbling and the rails had fallen off in places, leaving conveniently human-sized gaps. Every so often she grew dizzy and had to stop lest she fall. She feared it might be poisonous fumes found in some caves, but Lucan scoffed and told her she was overreacting. Janir followed her brother, listening carefully for any telltale creaks or groans to indicate the stairs were about to collapse. Lucan was by all appearances perfectly at ease, yet just because he looked that way didn't mean he was or that he should be. Not too long into their trek, Janir became aware of a new layer of magic, stronger. It rippled around them as they ascended before sealing back into place. Janir sensed it as a glossy film, forming an overlay or an invisible floor. She could only guess at its purpose, but it probably had something to do with the Morsanes. About halfway up. At least, she thought it was halfway up. She had no means of knowing how far they had come. She began to lose stamina. They had been through a lot in the past few hours, and she had gotten less than an hour's sleep. It was only her fear of falling that kept her alert. else she was sure she would have slept right there on the steps. Lucan trudged on, leaning against the rail for support. It was mostly intact toward the top, and he used it to pull himself along. Finally, they reached a landing at the peak of the stairs. Janir's legs burned, and she resisted the urge to sink to her knees. Lucan cursed. Janir stared at the last candle in the middle of the landing, and silently shared his sentiment. The trail simply stopped at a dead end.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.